The ballroom at Greybourne House held 200 candles, and not one of them illuminated Eliza Hartwell. She stood at the far edge of the room, near the tall windows that looked out on the street below, wearing a gown the color of river water, plain at the bodice, unornamented at the hem, and she held a fan that was not hers, because her own had lost 2 sticks in the autumn, and she had not replaced them. Lady Frome's ball, Lady Frome's house, Lady Frome's evening, and Eliza was the instrument by which the evening ran smoothly. She remembered which guests took their tea without sugar. She retrieved shawls when the room grew cold near the terrace doors. She stood precisely where she was needed, and disappeared when she was not. The orchestra was playing a set of country dances. The chandeliers trembled faintly with each passing footstep. And across the room, through the press of feathered turbans and evening coats and glittering conversation, the Earl of Ashmore had gone entirely still. She did not know he was watching her. She would not have believed it if someone had told her so. She was the companion, the useful, invisible instrument, the woman who stood near the windows. She was not watched. What she did not yet know was that the stillness Edmund Ashmore wore like a coat was not his natural state, and that a woman in a plain gown holding a borrowed fan had produced it. He did not move toward her. He did not speak. His face revealed nothing that any other person in the room could have read. The orchestra lifted into the next phrase of the dance, and the crowd swirled between them, and that was the end of it, or appeared to be. It was not the end of it. Eliza had arrived in London in early April, having traveled from the village of Creswick in a hired coach with 2 trunks, 1 small case of her father's books she could not bring herself to leave behind, and a folded letter from Mr. Jasper Hartwell's solicitor, Mr. Graves, which she had read so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases. The letter named a debt of £412. It explained that the debt was her father's, contracted against his modest house and the lease on his surgery, and that the house had been sold, but the sale had cleared only the larger portion. The remainder fell, with the delicate imprecision of the law, to Eliza. She had no brother. She had no husband. She had Mr. Graves's letter and her own capacity for useful silence. Lady Frome had taken her on at £30 a year, which was the going rate for a woman of respectable birth, and no fortune, and Eliza had accepted without bargaining because there was no position from which to bargain. She was to accompany the family to London for the season, to manage Miss Cecily Frome's schedule of engagements, to keep the correspondence, and to be on hand for whatever additional requirement the household generated. She understood the terms. She had been performing them without complaint since the 3rd of April. It was now the 15th of May, and she had learned 3 things about the season that no one had thought to tell her. The first was that it was relentless. The second was that invisibility required active maintenance, a kind of daily labor of posture and expression and precise situational positioning, and that the labor was exhausting. The third was that Lady Dorothea Vane, the mother of the late Countess of Ashmore, and the most formidable woman in any room she entered, had decided that Eliza was precisely the sort of person the room did not require. She had heard the phrase first at Lady Vane's own drawing-room, on the occasion of a morning call she had attended as Cecily's shadow. Lady Vane had been seated in a chair of considerable authority, a carved mahogany piece that suggested a throne without quite achieving one, and she had said to Mrs. Pelworth on the adjacent settee, in the voice of someone dispensing unexceptionable fact, "The companion? She is one of those quiet, useful creatures who fill the corners so the important people need not stand so near the walls. I expect she is very good at her function." The emphasis on function had been placed with surgical precision, and the word creature had been chosen, Eliza was certain, with full knowledge of what it did to the woman who heard it. She held her face smooth and her spine straight, and she did not allow her hands to tighten on the cup she was carrying across the room, and she set the cup down without sound and removed herself to the necessary corner. She had not forgotten the phrase. She did not expect she would. The position at Ashmore Park came about through a practical arrangement that Lady Frome described as a convenience. Lord Ashmore had agreed to receive Lady Frome and her daughter for a fortnight's visit in mid-May, and Eliza was required to come as part of the household's management. She was given a small room on the upper floor of the east wing, furnished with a narrow bed and a writing table and a window that looked over the kitchen garden. She was not consulted about the arrangement. She packed her 2 trunks and came. Ashmore Park was not what she had expected. She had expected the cold grandeur of a great house maintained for display, the kind of place that announces its own magnificence the moment you set foot inside. What she found instead was a house that felt as though someone had once loved it very much and had then stopped, not out of neglect, but out of an inability to continue. The carpets were good. The portraits were well preserved. The library, which she discovered on her second morning when she rose early and lost her way in the east corridor, was magnificent, floor to ceiling, with a gallery reached by a wrought iron stair. It smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something underneath that she could only identify as undisturbed air. She had stood in the doorway for a long moment before she registered that she was not alone. He was at the desk near the window. He did not look up immediately. He was writing, and he finished the sentence he was writing before he acknowledged her presence, which she noted was not rudeness but discipline, the action of a man who had learned to complete what he had begun. When he did look up, his expression was the same contained neutrality she had observed across the ballroom at Lady Frome's early-season entertainment, and his eyes were a gray that the morning light turned silver. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He knew her name. She did not know why this surprised her, but it did, and the surprise registered as a small increase in her pulse that she attributed to the embarrassment of trespass. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not know the room was in use. I will not disturb you." "You are not disturbing me." He set down his pen. "The library is not locked for a reason. You are welcome to make use of it." She thanked him and withdrew, taking nothing from the shelves because she had not come to take anything. She had come because she could not sleep, and the morning was long, and the books were there. She did not return that day. She returned the following morning, and he was not there. And she stayed for an hour with a volume of botanical illustration she had taken down because the plates were exact and beautiful, and she was careful to replace it precisely where she had found it. She did not tell herself she was hoping to see him again. She was honest enough, in the private jurisdiction of her own thoughts, to know that she was not entirely not hoping this. She did not examine the distinction closely. The witnessing scene, as she thought of it afterward, was not a scene she knew she was performing. It was simply a Tuesday evening in the second week of May when she went down to the kitchen passage to ask Mrs. Aldridge for a posset for her own headache, and found instead a girl named Nan, the youngest kitchen maid, sitting on the cold stone floor outside the scullery door, with a fever high enough to have put color in her ears and a look of determined misery on her face, that Eliza recognized as the look of someone who has been unwell for long enough that unwell has started to feel ordinary. Mrs. Aldridge was already preparing the posset. Eliza sat down on the low stool beside Nan, not on a chair but on the stool, at the girl's level, and she said, "Shall I read to you while you wait? It will give you something to think about besides the ceiling." Nan blinked at her with fever-bright eyes and said she didn't mind. Eliza had her father's copy of a novel by Mrs. Radcliffe in the pocket of her evening dress because she had been reading it in her room and had not thought to leave it behind. She opened it and read aloud, in a clear and measured voice, the chapter in which the heroine crosses the Alps in a thunderstorm, and she read it with sufficient expression to make the thunderstorm audible, the way her father had taught her. Nan listened. The fever did not break, but the girl's shoulders came down from around her ears, and she stopped watching the ceiling with that particular fixed stare that accompanies genuine suffering. Mrs. Aldrich moved quietly around the kitchen behind them. Eliza did not look up. She was not aware of Lord Ashmore until she had finished the chapter. She turned the page and glanced up to ask Nan if she wanted to continue, and she saw him standing in the doorway at the far end of the passage, perfectly still, a candle in his hand. He had come, she discovered later from Mrs. Aldrich, to request a glass of warm water for a reading that had run past 11, and he had stopped in the passage and stayed there without speaking for the better part of a chapter. His face when their eyes met was unreadable. He said, "Good evening, Miss Hartwell," in a voice that was level and gave nothing away, and then he withdrew, and she heard his footsteps in the corridor until they ceased. Mrs. Aldrich, who had her back to the door and had been watching through the reflection in the copper pan above the range, said nothing at all. She brought the posset, and she settled Nan on the kitchen settle, and she walked Eliza back to the stair. And at the bottom of the stair she paused and said, "You have a gift, miss, for making people feel attended to. It is rarer than you think." She did not say what she had observed from the range. She was a woman of considerable discretion. If you have found yourself in Eliza's position, carrying a weight that the world considers unremarkable, you may already know what it cost her to stand straight under it. Leave a word below if her story has found you, and stay close. Because what happens next is where everything changes. It was in the library, on the Thursday of the second week, that something shifted between them. She had come earlier than usual, not quite 7, and she had not expected him. He had not expected her. They met at the shelf that ran along the east wall, where the travel volumes were kept, because she had wanted Pennant's account of Scotland, and he had been replacing Bruce's volume of his Abyssinian journeys, after a night of insufficient sleep had driven him to read about mountains as a corrective to memory. He reached the shelf first, and then she arrived beside him, and they were standing closer than they had ever been, close enough that she could see the fine grain of the fabric of his coat and the shadow that fatigue had put under his eyes. He did not step back. She did not step back. The shelf was there, and the books were there, and the morning light was coming through the east window at a low angle that laid itself across the spines in a stripe of gold. "You read for pleasure," he said. It was not a question. "I read for a great number of reasons," she said. "Pleasure is among them." He looked at the shelf for a moment. "My wife did not read. She found the library cold." He said it without inflection, in the tone of a man reporting a geographical fact, and she understood from that tone more than she would have understood from grief. Grief was something one performed or suppressed. This was something else. The flat affect of a loss so long denied expression that it had become landscape. She looked at the portrait then, because there was one, on the wall between the two windows, a young woman in a white dress with dark hair and a lively expression that had been captured with some accuracy by the artist. She was beautiful. She looked like a woman who had never been cold in her life. "She was ill," Edmund said. And then he stopped, as though the sentence had reached its limit. Eliza did not say she was sorry, because she had heard that phrase offered to grief often enough to know what it did and did not do. She said, "Did she like the garden?" And she watched him register the question as one he had not expected. and watched something in his jaw release by a fraction. "Very much," he said. "She spent more time in it than the house. I should have stayed closer to home." The last sentence arrived with a weight that indicated it had been carried for 3 years, and she understood then that this was the wound. This specific sentence. That it was not the loss itself, but his account of his failure to prevent it. She understood also that he had not intended to say it to her, and that he had said it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. "Grief manufactures its own logic," she said carefully. "It is not always the logic of events." He looked at her then, directly, and what she saw in his face was not warmth, but its possibility. The way a room looks before the fire is lit. The architecture of the warmth already there. Waiting. He said nothing. He took the Bruce volume he had come to replace, set it on the shelf, and left the library. And she stood alone with the travel volumes and the portrait and the low gold stripe of morning light, and she pressed her palm flat against the shelf and breathed. She had not meant to say what she had said. She did not regret it. She was 23 years old, and her father had taught her that the accurate perception of a situation was worth more than any number of polite evasions, and she held to that lesson in the way she held to his books. At some cost, as the only thing left of the man who had taught her what things were worth holding. Lady Dorothea arrived at Ashmore Park on the Friday. She came in a carriage with her own crest on the door, and a maid and a footman, and a way of entering a room that suggested the room had been waiting for her specifically. She embraced Edmund with a proprietorial warmth, and looked at the rest of the household with the calm assessment of a person conducting an audit. When her gaze reached Eliza, it stopped for exactly 2 seconds before moving on, and in those 2 seconds, Eliza felt the full calibration of the woman's social instrument, the way it measured and dismissed and filed. At dinner that evening, while Eliza sat at the lower end of the table, where companions customarily positioned themselves, Lady Dorothea said to Mrs. Pelworth, who had come with her from town and sat on her right, in the voice she employed for undisputable facts, "The Hartwell girl is a curiosity, is she not? The type that makes itself quietly necessary. One can always find a use for a quiet, serviceable creature in a large house." She said it as though Eliza were a fire screen or a set of candle snuffers, and she said it clearly enough to be heard by 3 people at that end of the table. Eliza took a small portion of the fish course, and said nothing, and made her expression mild. Cecily Frome, at the center of the table near Edmund, laughed at something he had said with practiced spontaneity, and Lady Dorothea watched this with the contained approval of a woman whose plan was proceeding on schedule. It was only afterward, walking back along the upper corridor toward the east wing, that Eliza allowed herself to acknowledge what she already knew. Lady Dorothea had come to position Cecily as the correct choice. She had come to ensure that whatever anomalous attention Edmund had been paying to the edges of rooms where companions stood would be redirected to the center of rooms where appropriate young women of good family and no particular debt stood instead. The plan had a logic Eliza could not contest. She told herself this with the same precision she brought to the rest of her daily inventory of facts. She was the companion, the useful creature in the corner. She was 23 and owed £412 and possessed no family connections of any use and no expectation of a different outcome. Whatever she had heard in Edmund's voice in the library on Thursday morning was not addressed to her as someone the world had decided mattered. It was addressed to her as someone who happened to be present when it needed to be said. The way one speaks into a room that appears to be empty. She changed her dress for bed and blew out her candle and lay in the dark with the kitchen garden visible through the window, the pale row of onion tops showing in the moonlight. And she told herself this was simply the correct understanding of the situation, and she believed it, almost entirely. What dismantled that belief was what she overheard on the Saturday morning. She had not intended to pass the study. She was crossing from the east wing to the main stair to carry a letter of Lady Frome's to the post, and the study door was ajar, and Lady Dorothea's voice was not constructed for discretion. She heard her name first. Then she heard Lady Dorothea say, with the brisk efficiency of someone disposing of a minor household matter, "The Hartwell girl should be returned to London by Tuesday at the latest. I have spoken to Agatha about it. A companion at loose ends in a house where a gentleman is forming his impressions is precisely the sort of interference one removes before it becomes a complication. She is personable enough, in her way, but she has £400 in her father's debts, and a position that will not survive the season's end regardless. Let her go back to Greybourne House and continue to be useful there." There was a pause. She could not hear Edmund's response clearly, only its register, low and level. "Edmund," Lady Dorothea said, in the softer voice she employed when she was deploying rather than demanding. "Caroline would have wanted Ashmore to go to someone of standing. You know she would. You owe her that much, I think." Eliza moved away from the door without sound and walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window there, which looked out at the front drive, the gravel pale in the morning light. And she held Lady Frome's letter in both hands and breathed through the tightness across her ribs. She owed £412. She was a companion who would not survive the season's end. These were facts. They had always been facts. Lady Dorothea had not invented them. She had simply stated them in the language of social management, which was colder than despair, but not, Eliza supposed, less accurate. She thought about disappearing. It was the sensible thing. Pack the 2 trunks, take the small case of books, return to Greybourne House, and resume the useful invisibility. No confrontation, no scene, no cost to anyone, including herself. She stood at the window for 3 minutes. She delivered Lady Frome's letter to the post box by the front door. And then she went to find Edmund. He was in the library. Of course he was in the library. She knocked twice and opened the door and crossed to the desk where he sat. And she did not sit because she was not there for comfort or conversation. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she told him, in the clearest voice she had, exactly what she had heard through the study door, and exactly what she intended to do about it. "I am returning to London on Monday," she said. "Lady Frome has no need of me here, now that Lady Vane has arrived to manage the visit, and I think it is better for everyone that I go. But I want you to know, before I do, what it is you would be acting on if you chose to act on it." She paused. "My father left a debt of £412. It will take me somewhat more than 13 years to clear it at my current position, and I do not expect you to solve that problem, and I am not telling you so that you will feel some obligation toward me. I am telling you because you have been honest with me in this room, and I find I cannot be otherwise with you." She stopped. She had said everything she had come to say. He was looking at her with the same gray attention he had turned on her in the ballroom at the start of the season, the same quality of stillness she had not known. That first night was not his natural state. "How much?" he said. £412. She held his gaze. "I am not asking you for it. I understand what you are not asking." He stood. "Will you allow me to ask you something instead?" She waited. "What you did on Tuesday evening, in the kitchen passage, reading to that girl." He did not finish the sentence immediately. He looked at the portrait between the two windows, and she watched something pass across his face that was not grief exactly, but grief's resolution. The moment when a person stops arguing with a loss and simply acknowledges it. He looked back at her. "Mrs. Aldridge told me it was not the first time you had done something of that kind without being asked. She said," and here a slight compression appeared at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but had that architecture, "that you did it as though you expected no one to notice, which in her estimation was precisely the sort of thing worth noticing." "Mrs. Aldridge is observant," Eliza said. "She is." He looked at the portrait again. Then he crossed the room and turned it gently to face the wall. It was a deliberate motion, careful and private, and she understood what it cost him, and said nothing. He turned back. "Go to London," he said. "Attend Lady Frome's final ball at Greybourne House next Friday. I will be there." She did not know what this meant. She told herself it meant nothing, or nothing she was permitted to assume, because she had already spent considerable effort constructing the correct understanding of the situation, and she was not prepared to dismantle it on the basis of a sentence. She walked back to the East Wing, and she did not let herself hope. She was very nearly successful. The final ball of the season at Greybourne House was the event Lady Frome had organized as the crown of the season's work, the evening on which Cecily's prospects were to be consolidated, and Lady Dorothea's campaign was to arrive at its natural conclusion. The rooms had been dressed with white roses and hothouse jasmine, and the light from the chandeliers turned everything amber and gold, and 200 guests moved through the rooms in the elaborate slow choreography of the season at its height. Eliza arrived as she always arrived, beside Lady Frome, slightly behind, useful and unadorned. She wore the river-water gown again, because it was the best she had. She carried the fan with the 2 broken sticks, repaired now with a length of white ribbon she had found in Lady Frome's workbox, and asked permission to use. She positioned herself near the tall windows that looked out on the street below, where she had positioned herself at the first ball of the season, and she stood straight and held the fan, and watched the room. Lady Dorothea was at the center of things, as she always was. She stood with Miss Cecily Frome arranged beside her, and when Edmund arrived, Lady Dorothea moved toward him with the confident intention of a woman who has choreographed an evening down to its last quarter hour. Eliza watched him enter. He was wearing his evening coat with the precision of a man who has dressed correctly so many times that correctness has become unconscious, and he moved through the room the way he moved through every room she had observed him in, without announcement, but with a kind of density that caused other people to make space. Lady Dorothea met him near the doorway. Miss Frome was brought forward. The conversation lasted perhaps 4 minutes, during which Eliza looked at the street below the window and reminded herself that she had done what she had come to do. She had been honest. She had not begged. She had the small remaining dignity of having behaved correctly throughout. Then the room changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the quality of the air. The way a crowd's attention turns, collectively and almost involuntarily, toward a single point. She turned from the window. Edmund was crossing the room. He was not crossing it in the direction of Lady Dorothea or Miss Frome or any of the bright and appropriate young women who had been positioned throughout the evening in his probable path. He was crossing it in 3 long, unhurried strides that the crowd parted for, without being asked, because crowds do part for certain people, and he was coming in the direction of the tall windows, and the plain gown, and the fan with the ribbon-mended sticks. The room was watching. She understood in the moment he reached her that the room had been watching for some time, that whatever she had been telling herself about the correct understanding of the situation, the room had already arrived at a different understanding, and the room was waiting to see if it was right. He stopped in front of her. He did not bow in the way of formal introduction. He bowed in the way of genuine address, the small, deliberate motion of a man who means what his body is saying. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "will you dance?" The room held its breath. She held hers. "You should understand," she said, in a voice that was perfectly steady because she refused to let it be otherwise, "that I am not a suitable choice by any measure that this room applies." "I am aware of the room's measures," Edmund said. "I find I do not require them." From the near side of the floor, Lady Dorothea Vane's voice arrived, carrying across the brief silence with the precision of a woman accustomed to having the last word in every room she entered. "Edmund," she said, in a tone that was half reminder and half warning, "this is not." And then she stopped, because he had already offered Eliza his hand. She took it. The crowd did not gasp. It did something quieter and more significant. It rearranged itself. The way a room rearranges itself around a piece of furniture that has just been moved to its correct position, with the faint collective acknowledgement that this is where the thing belonged all along. 200 people found that they were watching, and their watching had the quality of witnesses rather than spectators, the difference being that witnesses remember. He led her onto the floor. She moved beside him, with her spine straight and her borrowed fan at her side and the white ribbon on the mended sticks catching the amber light. And the orchestra, with the fine social instinct of musicians who understand their function, lifted into a slow waltz without being asked. Lady Dorothea Vane stood at the edge of the floor with Miss Frome beside her, and Cecily's face registered the particular blank quality of someone whose script has been interrupted mid-sentence and who does not yet know what comes next. Lady Dorothea's face registered something more specific. A brief, exact moment of recognition, the kind that arrives when a person discovers that the thing they were certain of was simply what they expected. And what they expected was not the same as what was true. She closed her fan, which she had been holding at a measured height, and lowered it to her side. They danced. She was aware of his hand at her waist with an acuity that she would not have called nervous, because it was too warm for nerves. The precise warmth of being held by someone who is holding you with intention, rather than form. He did not speak for the first turn of the room. She could feel the attention of the guests like a weather system, a pressure in the air. She did not look at them. "You told me what you were not asking for," he said, when they had completed the first circuit. "I have been considering what I would ask, if I were permitted." She waited. "I would ask you to remain at Ashmore Park," he said. "Not as a companion, as its countess." He paused. "I should tell you that I am not a comfortable man. I have been told this by several people who wished me better of it. I am cold by habit and exacting by temperament, and I have been alone for long enough that I have forgotten some of the ordinary graces that company requires." His voice dropped to the register she had first heard in the library, the one that lived below performance. "You already know this. You sat in a kitchen passage and read about mountains to a feverish girl, and you told a man in a library that grief manufactures its own logic, and you refused to let me pay your father's debts, as though the paying would make a difference to the asking. I think you are the most honest person I have encountered in 3 years of a season I had no wish to attend." She had not known, until this moment, that she had been waiting for someone to see precisely those things and name them without apology. £412, she said very quietly, because she needed to say it one more time, to be certain it was in the room with them and not hidden under the waltz. "It will be cleared by Friday week," he said, "not as patronage, as a matter of household accounts, which will be yours to manage." The distinction mattered He had known it would matter. She did not know what to say, and she did not say anything. And the silence between them had the quality of an answer. "I am aware," he added, with the slight compression at the corner of his mouth that had the architecture of a smile without quite being one yet, "that this is an unconventional proposal conducted in the middle of a waltz in Lady Frome's ballroom, in front of 200 witnesses who are doing a poor job of pretending to talk to each other." She glanced, despite herself, at the nearest cluster of guests, who were indeed doing exactly that. "Very poor," she agreed, and something in her chest released, a tension she had maintained since April, since the letter with the soft creases, since the drawing room where she had been designated a useful creature in a corner, and she felt the release as something adjacent to warmth and somewhat larger than relief. "Then you will stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will stay." The waltz completed its final phrase. The crowd's collective exhale was not audible, but was felt, in the way that the resolution of a long note is felt, rather than heard. The satisfaction of a thing returning to its proper place. Mrs. Aldridge, who was not at the ball, because housekeepers do not attend balls, heard about it the following morning from the footman who had attended Lady Frome's household for the evening, and she received the account with the composure of someone who had not been entirely surprised. She went to the kitchen and brewed the first pot of the morning with a steady hand, and she said nothing to anyone, because nothing needed to be said. The season ended. The invitations that had addressed themselves to the Earl of Ashmore alone began, in the following weeks, to address themselves to the Earl and Countess of Ashmore, and the households that had catalogued Eliza as Lady Frome's useful companion recalibrated their social memory with the brisk adaptability of people who have always known how to adjust their ledgers. Lady Dorothea came to Ashmore Park once, in early autumn, and she sat across from Eliza in the drawing-room with the particular constraint of a woman who has been corrected without being crushed, and Eliza received her with perfect courtesy and ordered tea and asked about a mutual acquaintance she knew would give Lady Dorothea comfortable ground to stand on, because it was not Eliza's purpose to make the woman suffer, only to be present in a house where Lady Dorothea had intended someone else to stand. The visit was short. It did not recur. Lady Dorothea was not unkind in her subsequent references to the new Countess of Ashmore. She was simply, for the first time in Eliza's acquaintance with her, genuinely uncertain. The debt was cleared by the end of October. Mr. Graves sent the confirmation to Ashmore Park, where Eliza received it in the library and read it once and set it on the desk, and did not feel, as she had imagined she would feel, the specific lightness of a weight removed. What she felt was something quieter. The sense that the thing she had been carrying had been set down so gradually, across the month since the ball, that she had not noticed the exact moment of its absence until she looked up and found she was standing straight without effort. By the time the first snow fell, in the third week of November, Eliza had been Countess of Ashmore for 7 weeks, and the house felt different. Not because she had altered it substantially, but because a house changes when its inhabitants are willing to be present in it. She had moved 3 things: a vase of dried flowers that had been on the landing since before she could determine, a chair in the morning room that had faced the wrong wall, and the key to the garden gate, which had been hanging on a hook in the back passage since the late Countess's time, and which Eliza now kept in the pocket of her morning dress because she used the garden every day regardless of the weather. She was in the library the evening the snow began, sitting in the chair across from Edmund's desk, with the botanical illustration volume she had taken down on her second morning at Ashmore Park, and never returned to the wrong shelf. He was writing. The fire was sufficient, but not excessive, and the sound it made was the only sound in the room. Outside the tall windows, Snow was falling with the quiet deliberateness of something that has waited for the right moment, and the garden was going white. Edmund set down his pen. He said her name, not Miss Hartwell, not any of the forms of address the season had assigned her. He said simply, Eliza. In the same register he had used in the library that first morning, when something undefended had surfaced in his voice, and he had not retreated from it. She looked up from the botanical plates. He was watching her with the gray attention she had first seen across a ballroom full of candles, when she had been invisible to every other person in the room, and she had not known what it meant. And now she did. On the wall between the two windows, the portrait frame faced inward. The canvas turned gently to the plaster, carrying its memory quietly. The fire spoke in the grate. Snow lay itself across the kitchen garden outside, over the pale remains of the onion tops, over the gravel path, over the gate she kept the key for in her pocket. She had arrived at Ashmore Park with 2 trunks and a case of books and a letter with soft creases. She set down the botanical plates. The room held them both inside its warmth, and outside the window the snow continued, and the night was long, and she was home. If Eliza's story found something in you worth carrying, leave a word in the comments. She asked for nothing but to be seen, and being seen, it turns out, is where every real story begins.